Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with IIST, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, 5 Ideas Your Automation Framework Needs Right Now by Paul Grossman. We're excited you're able to join us today. Set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars to introduce the topics as well as the presenters of the upcoming SQTM conference in San Diego, California, September 13th through the 18th at the Sheraton San Diego Hotel and Marina. The conference focuses on advancing the test management and quality management professions by providing practical methods based on best practices. The ongoing theme of the conference, Practical, Proven, Feasible, keeps the focus on what works. To view the conference program and more information, visit www.qualitymanagementconference.com. You may submit your questions at any time by using your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at www.qualitymanagementconference.com. At the end of today's webinar, you will be asked to complete a short survey. At IIST, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Paul Grossman. Paul?
Thank you very much for that introduction, Eric. Everyone, my name is, my name is Paul Grossman. I'll just give you a little bit of a background of what my qualifications are working in test automation. I've been doing this job for the last 15 years, working with several different companies, everything from insurance to medical to online retail. And I've also given presentations at major conferences, not only IST, but I've also been out at HP Discover for several conferences. And I basically kind of tell people little tips and tricks about what I'm able to do with the tools that I work with. Those tools, for me, I'm working basically with HP Tools, which is QTP, which has now been renamed UFT, Unified Functional Tester. And prior to that, I started out a long time ago with Windrunner, working in a C-based language. We kind of called it C because it was C, but it didn't have any pointers. And if anyone laughed at that joke, you're a programmer. Congratulations. Thanks for taking the time to come on and check this out. So today, I'm going to talk to you about the 5 ideas your automation framework needs right now. And to start off with, we're going to have number 5, keywords and tokens. Now, you guys probably know about keywords if you're working in frameworks, framework design. You probably heard keywords talked about. Tokens are a little bit more different. I'm going to actually show you guys a little bit of code as we go along there. So stick with me. It'll get fun at the end. We're going to have a little thing going on there. Number 4, real-world object interaction. And I'll talk a little bit more why you want to do it the way an actual manual tester is going to be interacting with your application. Number 3, continuous integration, which is part of the Agile philosophy. And if you're a developer, you know how exactly that works for developers, but in the QA automation side, it also gives us a lot of very cool benefits as well. And number 2, insanity testing. Those of you know the definition of insanity? Well, you're going to learn it today, and we're going to find out why that is an important part of our framework and our design. And the number 1 thing that your automation framework needs right now is to be able to view your website that you're testing in 3D. So we're going to have a little bit of fun on that. So let's get started over here. Starting off with number 5, keywords and tokens. Now, if you are just starting off with automation, working with a framework, one of the first things you've probably heard, and this has been mentioned for many, many years, working about using a keyword-driven framework in order to create your automation scripts. And one of the major reasons we want to do and use keywords is, well, it hides the complexity of the code. So some of you guys may not want to get really deep into figuring out how Visual Basic and C and Perl and JavaScript, all that stuff works. So the idea is that we come up with keyword commands that look very close to plain English as close as possible so that you can build your own tests at a high level. And the developers, the test automation engineers, we kind of handled all the magic that goes on behind the scenes there. We have kind of a rule on that our keywords take no more than 3 parameters just to make it nice and simple. And you'll see a little sample of that. And then after that, we'll follow up with our tokens. Tokens are basically just a generic description, a little bit of string that's going to be changed and replaced with some other bit of data that might be intrinsic, such as, oh, I want to know what today's date is. Or it might even be captured from the application, or and it can be reused in other steps. And then that it can be embedded. It doesn't necessarily have to be the only value that we're passing into our keyword. It could be somewhere embedded inside of a full-length string. So let me talk about those keywords. As I said, we want to kind of make this simple so that we have the most amount of people who are available to actually create and generate tests in automation, create what they need. And I'm going to show you a couple of 3 examples I've got up here. The dotted lines there, they have a plain English statement, and they're kind of very low level, understandably. The first one says, click on the OK button. And if I were to change this into a keyword, I'd be looking for a keyword called click, and I'd be passing into it a string that says OK. And if a framework is pretty smart, you could say, okay, I'm looking for the cancel button, I'm looking for some other button, and go out and find it. Another thing we might want to do is we might have a drop-down list that has a list of all the months inside of it, and I want to select January or just Jan from that month. So I have another keyword called select from, and that keyword is going to take Jan as the item that we're looking for inside that drop-down list and select it. As my last example, I'm going to enter my last name, Grossman, into the field called last name. So I have a function here called enter into. And enter into, when we get into it, is going to look for the last name. Now I'm going to expand on just one of these because we really don't have time to get into all 3. But we're going to take a look at that enter into and see how that actually breaks down. And before we take a look at that, I just wanted to show you a little bit about the code hiding, the complexity of code. If I were to actually write this out as a line of code in QTP, it wouldn't be enter into last name Grossman. It would be my application name, the registration page, and then a web edit with the name last name embedded inside of it with a little bit of regular expressions, and then finally setting my name. By the way, if you kind of read this backwards, you could see that it says set the last name web edit on the registration page on the killer application browser to the name Grossman. It just kind of shows you that people who are developers, we think a little bit differently, and sometimes it kind of looks like we're thinking backwards, but that's okay. We're a kind of a unique breed out there. So here we are. I've got kind of a very the innards of that function, and stick with me, guys. I know there's a little bit of code out there, but it's not going to get too scary. I made it pretty condensed here. My enter into is going to bring in 2 items, and remember I said I'm going to try and keep the number of values that I'm bringing into my keywords limited to 3 or less. In this case, I've only got 2. So the first one is the name, and that's the name of the object we're going to go try and find. And the second one is the value, is the text that we're going to throw into that particular object. The second thing I've got up there says it's looking for a class. Now the class is, we already kind of know what that is. We're not kind of trying to look at all the objects that are on our web page. We're looking for only specific ones, and buttons and links really don't get to be typed into. There's only essentially one class of object that's going to be typed into, and that's our web edit. And we're going to take that name, the class, and the value, and the class and the name, and we're going to throw it into another function we're going to look at in just a second called getObject, and that is going to return to us a valid object and it's also going to tell us whether it did it right or not. Now, if this result comes back and says, hey, I was able to find an object, then we know that we got a pretty good chance that we can actually just go and set the value that we brought in here. Now, you might be asking, well, why go through all of this if I can just execute this line of code? Well, our objects don't necessarily need to be validated. They may not necessarily be one, they may not exist, or they may not even be enabled. And if either one of those are true, we might end up throwing an error. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment here. So I've validated that I was able to get an object. I'm going to go set the value that I typed in there. I want to put the name, last name Grossman into my valid object that I found, which had last name in it. And if this comes back and says false, well, this is actually a comment here. It's just basically for you and me, and whatever tool that you're doing, whatever framework you're working with. This is basically just a little reminder here. It says report that the value was not entered, and add whatever the last error that was detected was. And this is one of the most important things when we're designing frameworks, is that making sure that our output messages, our error messages, aren't something kind of generic like it didn't work. I don't want to see it didn't work or could not enter value, because could not enter value. I don't know what value I was trying to enter into, and I don't know what object I was trying to put it into. So the nice thing is, when we're reporting the value out, if something went horribly, horribly wrong, where our result came back false, we want to make sure that we have the name and the class. Grossman was not entered into the last name web edit. So we've got this fairly small, very simple enter into, and we're going to get into the next level, or kind of our second level. We're going to take a look at that get object and see how does that work. So when we're looking for that object, we're going to look for a valid object. And in a valid object, as I said, is one that's it's visible and optionally enabled. And we get what we're going to do is we're going to go and get a collection of objects. I apologize to you guys. We're going to edit that out, I'm pretty sure, and this. Okay, we were looking for a couple of objects out here, and they're basically our application, let's say, has a web edit, and there's got the last name in it. And we have another object. Let's say we've gone in our application. We figured out, before we got into this point, whether the user who is registering here is actually male or female. So maybe the requirement might say, okay, if the registrant here has been determined to already be male, we don't need to ask for a maiden name on the application. But when we go and get a collection of objects, we are asking the tool to say, okay, go out to that web page and give me a collection of all the web edits that are out there. It can come back with not only what's visible, but what is not visible. And we want to kind of sort through those objects and make sure that we get the right one, have our best shot at getting the correct one. And if we're doing this correctly, we should be able to reduce our maintenance as we go along. So the first question we're going to go through is, we've got a collection of these objects, and we're going to ask each one of them, we're going to go through and say, okay, does some property contain the name that we had passed in? What was the name of his last name? And that property that we're looking for, it could be in any one of a few different properties. Most commonly, developers will stick that string right to the name property. Secondly, they might put it into the HTML ID property. And your tool that you've got, I know Selenium and QTP both have spies that you can go and look into. If you guys are a little bit more advanced, you might open up the developer tool under your browser and just look at the way the objects are described. And you'll also see that there are other properties like inner text, there's outer text, there is inner HTML, outer HTML. Any one of those properties are probably going to have the string that we are looking for, and you'll also probably see with your developers, if they're following a good standard, they're going to have the same way that each one of their objects are created. And so your web edits might all have the name populated, maybe HTML ID is blank, and maybe your links will have another property always populated. And in fact, I even put in SRC. It stands for source. And in that case, we might be looking for an image. And the text that we're looking for is going to be embedded in, usually in the image name itself at the very end, where the image has got, it says, okay, I need to throw up the OK PNG so that I know there's an OK button out there. So that's our first question we asked. Hey, did we find an object that actually contains the string that we're looking for? And if not, we're going to go to the next object and skip it. Skip on to the next object if we didn't find it that it matches out there. The next thing I want to talk about is visibility in properties. Now, it used to be, way back in the olden days, that we could actually use the visible property to identify whether this particular web edit is actually visible or not. And today, it's almost, at least in my experience in the last 3-4 projects I've worked on, it's almost never set. It's almost always saying, yeah, it's true. Yeah, that object, even though it's not visible to anybody, it's totally visible. So it's no longer a reliable property that we can use to identify whether this is something we can actually see and interact with or not. So we need to have a couple other ways to actually look at our objects and then ask, oh, are they actually visible? And one way you can do is you can go to the height property of this particular object and say, hey, is that greater than 0? If the height or even the width is set to 0, it doesn't exist. It doesn't. You can't see it. And if you can't see it, you can't click on it, you can't type into it, you can't work with it. And I've seen developers hide them like that. I've also seen some of the tools create the objects and they hide them by setting the absolute Y value to less than 1, to 0 or even less than that. And again, that particular property is a really good indicator that this is not something that anybody's going to be able to see on the screen at this time. Sometimes they use something else. There might be some other way that you're going to have to go through and take a look at your validation to identify if an object is visible or not. And the last way I can think of it is that you may actually have to go into CSS. That's the cascading style sheets. There we go. Cascading style sheets. And in there actually may be values that are set, whether they're set to display or none, and indicating that, okay, this is going to be there or it's not going to be there as we see it. So we get through this loop, and we've asked all these 4 questions. If all of them come back and say, yes, 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 we can see all this thing, we know that it's a value, it's a valid object. The last one, which is kind of optional, is, well, great, I can see it, but is it enabled? Is enabled set to true, or is disabled set to false? And depending on what kind of object you're working with, you may see one or the other property, enabled or disabled, as being true or false. And if it's not, well, then if it is disabled, then there's no data entry that's possible. If all this passes, we've pretty much got our object. And I'm not going to sit there and say, okay, let's go check the other ones. We're going for our real closest match of our object that's going to work for us. So more than likely, this is our object. We're going to return that as a valid object, and we're going to set our Boolean success value to true. We're going to come back out of this get object property and say, yep, the success was true. Something I don't think I mentioned at the beginning. When we start this code, we look at this and we say, okay, the return value that we're going to have is going to be false. And I don't have to set false in each one of these when we exit out. We're false until we get to the point that, okay, you found the correct object. We're going to now set our success to true. And the nice thing about that is that when we come out of this function, we know exactly if we can interact with the object that we return. Because if we didn't find an object, that the object we're returning, that valid object, that is not going to be anything. It's going to be nothing when it comes back. And again, we don't want to be taking a nothing object and trying to set some sort of value to it. And there's our return of our success value at the end. And that kind of takes us all the way through kind of our code words, so keywords. We got all the way kind of down into some deep code in there. I'm going to kind of come back up and we'll talk a little bit about tokens. Now, tokens are strings that are being passed in from some sort of data source, and they're being generic. So let's say we have a test that says This message should have today's date in it, but today's date is August 31st, and it's going to be different tomorrow. It's going to be September 1st tomorrow, and I don't want to be going through all my tests and trying to change my data as we go. So I'm going to try and have my tokens that are going to change on their own to reduce my amount of data maintenance that I've got. The tokens are replaceable strings, and they need a unique identifier. So I've basically shown you a whole bunch of unique identifiers that we have at the bottom. And down there, they're basically, I've gone through the keys 1 through 0 and found all the other characters that most likely aren't going to appear as part of text and identifies as possible unique identifiers. But I'm going to exclude the ones that are common punctuations, like a question mark and a $sign, and @ might come through as a email. We're not going to use any of those. I'm also going to exclude anything that's a regular expression, and that is some of them are already eliminated, like the question mark, but also the caret and the star. I'm going to get rid of those guys because those might come through as regular expressions. That's really advanced stuff. We won't talk about that in this particular course, but it could be that we have a regex coming through saying, let's make this kind of more generic so we can find matches everywhere. The last thing is I'm going to exclude any HTML text, so the left, the greater than, the less than symbols go out, and that leaves us with basically 2 characters. One is an accent, and the other one is a tilde. And what do you know? They actually have to be sitting on the same on the button. They're both on the same button. So it basically comes down to you as you want to hit the shift key or not to use that particular character as a identifier for a token. Now me, I actually like the tilde better. So for this demonstration, I'm going to go use that. I am actually shifting that key, but it's nice and easy. It's up in the left-hand corner. And this is what it would look like. Let's say we would have a keyword. Here we are, verify the text. It appears somewhere on the screen, and in this case, we're verifying that an order got submitted, and it got it submitted on, there's our little tilde, and today. So this identifies us that this is going to be the token, and we're going to replace it before we get to the validation with today's date. Now, how in the world are we going to do that? Hold on, we're going to go to take a look at some code and see how that gets done. So here's some examples of some code out here I've got. And these are the 4 or 5 things that you need to actually build this up so that you can start replacing tokens in your framework. The first thing I want to do is, well, did I actually have that tilde somewhere? So the string that I passed in where it says that the order was completed today, on today's date, is inside this variable called str for string. And we're looking for that tilde. And in string is the code and keyword for Visual Basic for identifying where that is. It can be different in other different languages. I'm going to kind of let you guys work out what that is because we just don't have time to run through test complete and QTP and UFT and Selenium to do that. The next thing is, if we did find this, it's actually there is a tilde somewhere in the string. It's greater than 0. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go and split that string and using the split command and split it with the spaces that are in between this. And what this is going to do is give us an array of all the words that are in that string. Now all you have to do is go through each one of those words and see which one of those guys is our token. So here's a nice little for next loop, and it's going to go through the upper bound of the array. The upper bound basically says how many items are in there, and by the way, it's 0 base, so we have to subtract 1 to get to the very last item there. And then we're going to do that in string again, just like we did, except this time we're looking at the individual item, and we're looking to see if this is the very first character that is on there. If it's somewhere else, it was part of some of the string that got passed in. We're only concerned if we only know that it's a token if it's the very first character. And this is where we kind of expand stuff out a little bit. We have a select case, which is going to take our whole string, and we're going to lowercase it so that if it happens to be a little uppercased in our string, it's not going to, we don't have to kind of conform to making sure that, well, today's got a capital T or a lowercase t, or it's all capitals, or has to be all lowercase. In this case, we just make sure that we convert this down to a lowercase string, and here we have our first string that says, okay, I found tilde today is going to be this particular string, and we're going to replace that. We're going to take that particular string out here, the array, which is item, I think it was number 6 in that array, and replace it with an internal function that gives us today's date. Cool. And then once we found that, we will loop through. We might have multiple tokens inside of one string. Maybe multiple items are getting replaced as we go. So we don't want to stop. We just want to keep going till we get to the end. And the last thing is we're going to use the join function, which is the opposite of the split. And it's going to take that array, put our spaces back in there, including the text that we replaced for today, and send it back out. We say, hey, we just replaced a token, a generic date, a generic token with today's date. Now in this case, we can take this code here and we can start expanding onto it. Of course, we want to know today's date. We want to know if it's, maybe we have something that says tomorrow's date or yesterday's date. Or maybe we want to do next month or next year. Maybe we want to have a first name or a last name. And if none of these guys appear, well, there's one of two things that could be going on. The first thing is, well, we report back a message that says, hey, you guys gave me a token. I don't know what this token is. I have no idea. And remember, put that into the output, into the message. It says, you asked for a token. You asked for Thursday, and I don't know what the Thursday token is. So that's one thing you can do. Or the next thing, and this one I'm going to have, I'll let you guys go out there and kind of take a look, is we can add a dictionary, or we're going to call it, some people call it a hash table, to capture and reuse token keys and values. So here I might have in my dictionary or my hash table a key that says first name, and whenever I have the word first name out there, I'm going to replace it with testing, and my last name is always going to be tool. Now, if I go and put some orders through my system, well, since all those orders have the name, first name, last name, testing, and tool, we can always identify the ones that are generated by our automation. Sometimes managers come in, did you do this? Did you make this system do this? Did you put 100 orders through my system? I might have. How many orders do we have from testing tool? Oh, we have 100. Okay, yes, it was me. Okay, kind of cool. Or maybe, maybe we found some sort of issue that we can follow up on. So if we had that, we would have a another keyword. This is capture, and it says go find me a zip code field, and go and capture into original zip code. And then it says, okay, well, the zip code for this address here, you might recognize this. This is the, for our older developers, that is the fictional address for the Munsters, 1313 Mockingbird Lane. And since it was filmed in California, they're probably out there at 90210. So we're going to go and replace that zip code with a zip code out of Illinois. In fact, that's Mount Prospect, Illinois. Very nice town. And then at the end of our test, we've verified that we were able to change our zip code. We come back and we do enter into our zip code, but instead of putting in 90210, we're going to put in that token that says, oh, the original zip code that I pulled out and saved off, the 90210, put it back in there and reset our test. And that's where we're going to go off on that. And I'm going to let you guys figure out how you do it in your particular tool going forwards. I think I've given you guys the ideas. So let's see where you go from there. Next, number 4, real-world object interaction. Yeah. So why am I trying to find these objects? Why don't I just put a description in there and use it? Well, the reason is there's another thing that goes on today. Remember, I mentioned that the property for determining if an object is visible isn't really all that valid anymore. And in fact, an object that is disabled is becoming less and less reliable for us. And here's an excellent example. Here's a little application, the Rapid Workbench demo. And in this case, there is a dialog that is up front of the that is up front, up here, in front of all these other objects. And these objects out here are basically they're disabled from a manual test point. As a manual tester, I can't click on them. But you know, from the automation standpoint, the tool, it don't care. It's going to go out there and go click on these things. And by the way, I'm going to let you guys know at this point, I do see a couple questions popping up over here, so I'm going to answer those questions when we get out to the end of the presentation. So type in the questions, and I'll get to them at the end. So if I've got this dialog over here open, I'm going to, if I want to try and click on it, I might be able to actually interact with it, but I don't want to do it that way. I don't want to use a method that's built in, say my object, go click on it. This allows us to click on it even if it's manually impossible. What I want to do is verify that our web button is valid, and we already walked through that in our first section. And then we can go out and get the two properties out of it that get the absolute X and the absolute Y property from this particular object. And then move our mouse, rather than doing that method, we're going to move our mouse to that particular selection, to that XY coordinate location, and add 5 pixels to each side. And then perform a mouse click, or depending on your tool, it may say, okay, give me an XY coordinate, I'll go do a mouse click at that location. And what this does for your framework is it allows you to more reliably mimic what a manual tester is actually doing, rather than allowing your automation tool to go interact with an application that might be working in that might be actually disabled at that time, but can't be interacted with a manual tester. So why would we want to do that? Well, why wouldn't the object exist? Well, there's a couple of reasons. If we're trying to click on something, maybe the button doesn't exist. Maybe Ajax is still updating it. Maybe it's been removed from the application, it just doesn't appear there anymore. Maybe the properties have changed, we just can't find the button. In that case, we have to do a little bit of maintenance. Or maybe the button's been moved to a different page or tab, or there might be more than one button that is matching the description. And again, if we're looking at going through that collection of objects, we go and grab the first one that's out there and try to interact with that to keep our maintenance pretty low, rather than trying to figure out, well, I got 2 buttons, which one is the one I'm going for? Because one of the reasons is, if you do actually click on a button that is not there or not enabled, you're going to throw some sort of error message. In fact, in QTP, it throws a runtime error, which I hate to see those. So that's why I started doing my design, so I can verify my objects are good before we interact with them. Or the button, as there's a couple more reasons here, the button may not be enabled. There may be a window over the button, as we saw 2 slides ago. It might be inside of a container or scrolled off screen. Some automation tools will say, hey, it's not visible because it's off the screen. Some of them will, some won't. Or the button launched a modal dialog box that covered the screen on top of it. Now you can't interact with it. Or the worst case scenario, the application just closed and disappeared in a puff of logic. So how do you determine if a button is valid? Well, we can go out there and see if the button has an exist property, and if that's equal to true, and then is it enabled? And if that's true, then hey, we just come back and say, yep, our button was enabled, button was valid, it's true. And that particular value comes back through our button is value function, and we know that we can continue on with a click if it's valid, or we can skip it and say, I don't know. And we would report out if the button wasn't enabled or if it doesn't exist somewhere, and into perhaps some reporting variable, a global variable that we can pick up somewhere. And then at the next higher level, we say, whoop, we couldn't click on that particular button, and report that out. All right, so that's kind of our generic version of that. Let's go to number 3, continuous integration, something that your framework needs right now, because we're talking about Jenkins if you want the free version, or Hudson if you want a paid tool over there. You want to also interact with Subversion, Tortoise, at least that's what I use for my source code, and I'm going to show you why. The important thing about continuous integration, that's part of Agile, and developers use Agile in order to use continuous integration of Agile in order to determine very quickly if they've broken the build. So what they do is that basically the developer will commit some change. And by the way, these aren't the automation engineers. These are our developers who are making the application for us. They commit some new library or make some sort of change, and Jenkins goes out and automatically builds the application. It's not going to push it out anywhere. It's just going to build it. And then it comes back and says, hey, the build kind of fell apart on you. Something's terribly wrong. And within a few minutes, the developer knows, oh, that last thing I put out there, there's something wrong with it. And they go back, they fix their code, they push it back in again. The Jenkins builds the application again and comes back and says, okay, this time everything passed. You're good. You're green. We're good to go. So it's just the build, not the execution, because that's where us automation engineers are going to come in. We want to test that that thing that they build, that passed the build, actually worked. So from our side, we can also use Jenkins to go and run a smoke test. And as you know, as us as engineers, we are developers. We also have our collection of libraries, and we are making changes to our code to make more things happen and neat things. And occasionally we push something in there, and it breaks our framework. We don't even realize it. But with Jenkins, we can have, every time we push something into Subversion, we can have Jenkins detect that and then go run some smoke tests, a couple of tests that only report back to us and says, oh, hey, you know what, these tests, the test last time you ran it with the old code, hey, it worked great. Today it ran it, it just fell apart. So we can very easily, just like developers, get the response back that we need that tells us whether the code that we're developing is good or not. A couple other things you can do. You can actually have Jenkins determine, keep an eye out on the URL of the developers. And maybe the developers are pushing out their brand new version of their application. Maybe they forgot to send us an email, maybe 2-3 hours later. Oh yeah, by the way, it's out there. Forgot to tell you guys. Well, that's okay. Jenkins can see that it's out there. And it will run our regression tests, our automation regression tests. And I would recommend that you can actually, in Jenkins, you can put in a 30-minute wait, and I recommend that because I've noticed once they push something out there, even though the URL is available, it still takes about 15 to 30 minutes for the whole thing to kind of stabilize and everything's up and running and everything's available. So if it were to fail, again, we go out and investigate, hey, what happened here? Why is the brand new application failing? And where is it? Is it on the dev side or is it on our automation side? Another thing we can do within continuous integration, someone might say, I'd like to see these scripts run every single night, 3 o'clock in the morning while you're asleep. So absolutely, Jenkins can do that. They can go and run our automated regression suites every night at 3 o'clock, or you can have it run every Tuesday, or something like that. And again, reports back the results and says, hey, either it failed and we have to go investigate, or everything passed and everything is all okay. Now this changed slightly, you may not have seen it, but another way that we do continuous integration that benefits us is that we have Jenkins run the tests immediately because, hey, someone just said, oh, we have a new database available. Go test and see if it works. The old one's been gotten rid of. We have new connections in there. No change to the URL, but go ahead and run it. Okay, cool. Run it right now. We can run Jenkins tests right away. Number 2, insanity testing, something that your framework needs. The definition of insanity is performing the same actions again and again and expecting a different result. And this actually sometimes happens where we actually run 50 tests and 4 of them failed. And you go back and you run some of those 4 tests and 3 of them failed and 1 passed. What happened there? Well, in that case, the reasons that a test might fail and pass is, well, maybe your network connection is kind of flaky. Maybe 2 tests, and I've seen this myself, are mutually exclusive. You run test 1, which sets up the system to make test 2 fail. You run test 2, it sets up the system to make test 1 fail. I've actually seen that, and that's when I started thinking, maybe insanity testing might be the way to go. But we don't want to run all 50. We just want to run the ones that fail, give them a second shot, make sure that we're actually verifying that the results we're getting are actually repeatable. And the test environment may have been still stabilizing at the first run. And what's really cool is, hey, we're back over to Jenkins. Somebody actually came up with this idea, and they have a flaky test handler plugin that you can actually put in there and tell Jenkins, all right, hey, if these tests don't work, whichever one of these 4 that failed out of the last 50 you ran, run them again just to make sure that they're out there. If you designed your own framework, you might want to think about putting that in there, just keeping track of the ones that failed, and then running another list that says, okay, just check mark these 4 that have failed, run them one more time, give me those results. All right, and the number one thing you want to do is you want to be able to view your website in 3D, because we want to see all those objects that are behind the scenes, especially if we're looking for an object and we find one that maybe isn't the one that's on top, it's one behind the scenes. If we're sending a method to that, maybe that might be an issue. But if we're working with real-world interaction, we're actually moving an object, our mouse over this object, regardless if it's one behind it. So let's take a look at how that's going to do. I'm going to switch over for a moment here, and you're going to see good old Firefox. And here is a really cool site, the International Institute of Software Testing. And the way we do this is that we can go and put in an add-on. The add-on is an extension. We're going to type in here. It's called Tilt, T-I-L-T. And I'm going to hit it there, and we should have a Tilt. We're going to install that. It's downloading. It's in there. And the next thing is we got to restart. When the website comes back up, we're going to see that we have a brand new option over on our right-hand side under Developer, and it's called Tilt. And when you hit Tilt, we can actually drag our application around and see it in a really cool way. You can see all the extra pages that are out there. We can actually see it in a wireframe mode. And we can also double-click on these items and see what the code is that's associated with that particular line of that particular item that's out there. Kind of neat. However, that's not the only way you can do this. I'm going to exit out, and I'm going to go back over here, and I'm going to go to, we're going to hit the F12 key, and we're going to come up with our developer side. And we're going to go into our toolbox, and if you go under our toolbox and way at the bottom here, there's this thing called 3D view, and you're going to notice that a little square round cube has appeared on our site. We click on that cube, and guess what? We got the exact same thing. And if we go to our inspector, which shows us the code, the HTML code behind the scenes, and double-click on something, it jumps us exactly to those sites, that particular area that we're looking at. And this should help you actually identify objects as we go along, trying to build stuff as we go. All right, that basically brings us back to, well, that was the number one thing that you can build. I showed you could find it in Tilt, or you can actually find it in the toolbox. And that brings us to the end of our presentation of our 5 different items. And if there's any questions, I'm going to go take a look at the questions list and see where we're at from there as soon as I get this back up. All right, let's see what kind of questions I've got here. Can you recommend any books, videos to learn about automation frameworks? Well, I would like to recommend frameworks are basically, they're big generic information. They're kind of a whole bunch of ideas kind of squished together. Unfortunately, I'm kind of pigeonholed into the tool that I work with, and that's QTP. So I can recommend 3 books there. It is the books written by Tarun Lalwani, and that is the QTP Unplugged, which is now UFT Unplugged, and he's got 3 books in that series. He does talk about all the different interesting processes, and you put it all together, and it basically becomes kind of a framework. There are several other authors out there who also write books about how designing, how to work on frameworks. Unfortunately, none of them are coming to mind at the moment. However, you know what? I'm going to, after this course, we're going to go and look up a few and give you some recommendations out there. The second question I've got over here was, what is the difference between tokens and a global variable? Cool. Great question from Yan Zhang out there. The difference between that is that a global variable, well, that actually fits into what we call a a bad programming practice. I really don't like using global variables because they can be declared anywhere, changed anywhere. If you actually use a dictionary, you can actually keep all the variables, and yes, they are global. They can be interacted with anywhere, but you at least all have your objects, all your variables, your variable keys, and the values that are associated all in one area. And that kind of gets around the bad programming practice of having global variables kind of floating around. Let's see. And tokens are essentially the global variables that's actually inside the code. And we're at that point, we're kind of associating values into a variable. Not something I really would recommend doing inside the code. But in this case, we actually have the tokens are outside. It's the data coming in that's being replaced by something inside of our framework. Let's see. I have another question out here. The biggest issue I spend time trying to overcome is when the web page is up, but some JavaScript is still loading a list or whatever, and can't click on the button until the list is done loading. And there's nothing to say when it's done loading. Great question. I love that. That is one of the most common questions I get asked. Is how in the world do we check to make sure that our synchronization is actually ready? So I'm going to give you a couple of suggestions. I've solved this almost 4 times over. Off the top of my head, I'm going to try and come up with as many as I can remember. Obviously, the first one was for working in QTP. It's there's a sync out there, but it doesn't quite work with when we're working with Ajax. Second thing you can try is you can get. Remember we were talking about getting a collection of objects. Try getting a collection of all the objects and waiting about a quarter second and getting another collection of objects and checking your count and see if the count matches. Usually as Ajax is building the page, the count of objects is going up or down and changing as it adds more and more objects to the page. Another interesting way that I was able to do this was we actually checked the pixel color inside of the browser's the icon for the browser. I'm going to bring up our browser back up here for a second just to kind of show you. I'm not sure. I hope you can see my cursor up here. I'm not sure if I can. But we were able to see what is going on when, let's see if I can generate something out here. If you see in the upper left-hand corner, you saw that there was a little icon that kind of was spinning around. So the icon spinning, we checked to see if its color was not gray. And then on Firefox, it's since it's actually circular up there, not as good as it used to be, but you can check that out and see if you can find something that's not gray. If it is gray, that thing is still spinning. And if it is, if it is gray, it's still spinning. If it becomes any other color than that, then it most likely is not spinning, and you can stop there and determine, okay, the page is done loading. I think we're good on that. That's 2, and that was the kind of the easiest and then the most outlandish way of trying to determine if the page is loaded. And unfortunately, I can't think of the 3rd and 4th ways that I did it. Again, I'm going to put that one off onto my list and see if we can come up with another answer for that. But it is a great question. Thank you very much for asking that one. I don't see any more questions on the lists out here, so I'm going to flip this back over to our presentation and I'm going to turn this back over to Eric. Do remember, before I do that, we do have this conference coming up September 13th through 18th, and if you'd like to see a full class taught on test automation, I'm going to be out there. I'm going to actually be teaching a class on Friday out there in San Diego. Beautiful, beautiful town. California's always got wonderful weather, as I hear. Sometimes it's a little bit of a drought going on there, so bring your bottles of water. But aside from that, I hope that I get to see some of you out there. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Eric. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. That was a very interesting webinar. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for joining us today for this webinar sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit www.iist.org. You can follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about IIST news, events, and promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day.